They say Africa was underdeveloped, a dark continent waiting to be saved. But what if I told you that's the biggest lie in modern history? Before the colonizers came with their guns and flags, Africa wasn't broken. It was booming. Empires flourished, cities thrived, trade routes stretched across deserts and seas, gold, ivory, salt, knowledge. Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered, it was already shaping the world. But Europe didn't come to admire it. They came to erase it. They mapped the coasts not to learn but to conquer. They drew borders not to unify but to divide. And they didn't just take land, they took people, resources, languages, futures. Africa wasn't colonized in a day. It was dismantled systemically, violently, and deliberately. This is not the story of how Africa was born. This is the story of how it was stolen. In the next section, we'll uncover the powerful kingdoms and empires that once defined Africa, long before Europe ever set foot on its shores. Long before the first European ship touched African shores, greatness was already etched into the continent's soil. In the west, the empire of Mali rose under Mansa Musa, a ruler so wealthy that his gold-laden pilgrimage to Mecca disrupted economies for years. His capital, Timbuktu, wasn't just a trading hub, it was a beacon of learning. Libraries, universities, and scholars filled its streets, attracting minds from across the Islamic world. Africa was not only rich in resources, it was rich in intellect. To the south, great Zimbabwe stood tall. Its towering stone walls, built without mortar, housed kings and commanded trade routes. Archaeologists once refused to believe Africans could have built it, a denial born from colonial arrogance, not evidence. In the east, the Swahili coast flourished with a fusion of African, Arab, and Persian culture. Cities like Kilwa and Mombasa traded gold, slaves, and spices across the Indian Ocean, centuries before European navies arrived. To the north, Egypt and Nubia had already rewritten history thousands of years earlier, building pyramids, developing advanced agriculture, and ruling empires, while much of Europe was still tribal. And in Central Africa, the Kingdom of Congo had complex systems of governance, military organization, and foreign diplomacy. They sent ambassadors to Europe, not as subjects but as equals. This was Africa before colonization. Diverse, advanced, sovereign. A continent where trade wasn't forced, languages weren't erased, and borders weren't drawn in European boardrooms. But that golden age made Europe hungry, not to learn, but to control. And soon explorers would arrive, not with respect, but with a plan. In the next section, we'll see how the European powers first approached Africa. Smiling, trading, promising peace, and how deception became their deadliest weapon. They didn't come with armies at first. The Europeans arrived with gifts in their hands and crosses on their necks. Traders, missionaries, explorers. They spoke of friendship, trade, and salvation. And many African leaders, open to diplomacy, welcomed them. The Portuguese were among the first. By the 1400s, they had reached West Africa's shores. They traded beads and muskets for gold and ivory. But what they really wanted was power, and so began the slow poisoning of trust. Missionaries came next, spreading religion, yes, but also reporting back to their governments about the land, the people, and the opportunities for control. These were not innocent spiritual visitors. They were scouts. African kingdoms, unaware of the storm ahead, engaged in trade deals, with nations like Portugal, France, and Britain, believing they were building alliances. But the Europeans documented everything, resources, routes, rivalries, and waited for the right moment to turn those alliances into chains. Some African leaders, sensing the growing danger, resisted early. The Congo king Afonso I wrote letters to the Portuguese begging them to stop enslaving his people, but the reply never came. The profits were too good. What began as trade turned into manipulation. What began as diplomacy became dominance. Maps were drawn, reports were sent, and slowly the idea of conquering Africa, not just trading with it, took hold in European capitals. Africa didn't see it yet, but the chessboard was being set. The next move would redraw the entire continent. In the next section, we'll witness the scramble for Africa, when European empires carved up the continent like a cake without a single African in the room. In 1884, European leaders gathered in Berlin, not to end a war, not to sign a peace treaty, but to divide a continent they didn't own. No African leader was invited. No African voice was heard. But maps were laid out, lines were drawn, and in just a few months the fate of millions was sealed. This was the Berlin Conference, the event that turned Africa into real estate. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, and others carved the continent, like slices of cake, arguing over rivers, mines, and ports, not people. They weren't interested in cultures or kingdoms. They were interested in resources. What followed was a ruthless land grab known as the Scramble for Africa. In just a few decades, almost 90% of the continent was under European control. Families were split by borders that made no sense. Rival tribes were forced into the same colonies, while ancient nations were erased overnight. Britain took Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, and South Africa. France seized West Africa. Belgium stole the Congo. And what happened there would stain history in blood. Germany grabbed parts of Namibia, Tanzania, and Cameroon. Portugal held on to Angola and Mozambique. But this wasn't just about land, it was about dominance. Europe didn't just want Africa's gold and diamonds. They wanted its people to forget who they were, to replace African pride with European rule. Flags were planted, schools were rewritten, traditions were outlawed. The theft of territory was only the beginning. In the next section, we'll expose the brutal reality behind colonization. The forced labor, the stolen resources, the cultural erasure, and the everyday violence that turned Africa into a colony of pain. Behind every railroad the British built, behind every school the French opened, behind every church the Belgians erected, there was violence. Colonization wasn't a civilizing mission. It was a business, enforced at gunpoint. In the Congo, under King Leopold II of Belgium, men were forced to harvest rubber, under threat of mutilation. If quotas weren't met, hands were chopped off, not just of workers, but of their wives and children. It's estimated that 10 million Congolese died during Leopold's reign of terror. 10 million gone for profit. In German Southwest Africa, the Herero and Nama peoples were pushed into the desert, their water poisoned, their resistance met with genocide. The survivors? Sent to concentration camps, decades before Hitler would replicate the idea. The British extracted gold from South Africa and cocoa from Ghana. The French plundered oil and uranium from West Africa. The Portuguese drained Angola and Mozambique of labor and land. Forests were cut, rivers were dammed, mountains were emptied. But colonization didn't just loot minerals, it looted minds. Traditional religions were labeled as pagan. African languages were banned from schools. Children were taught European history, not their own. Statues of foreign kings rose where ancestral shrines once stood. Generations grew up believing they were inferior, their past uncivilized, their future only valid if it wore European clothes and spoke European words. And when Africans resisted, they were met with the whip, the bullet, the prison, and the gallows. This wasn't development. This was domination. In the next section, we'll uncover the massacres and resistance movements that history tried to bury, from north to south, east to west, where Africans stood up, fought back, and paid the price for daring to be free. Africa did not bow quietly. From the deserts of Sudan to the hills of Algeria, from the savannas of Zimbabwe to the coasts of Ghana, resistance rose like wildfire. When the British marched into Sudan, they were met by the Mahdist uprising, fierce warriors who fought for faith and freedom, and who reclaimed Khartoum, if only for a moment. In Zimbabwe, spirit mediums led the first Chimurenga, a rebellion of the Shona and Ndebele people against British occupation. They were defeated, but not erased. Their spirits would rise again in later generations. In Kenya, the Mau Mau fought a brutal guerrilla war against British rule. For their courage, they were detained in camps, tortured, and labeled terrorists, only to be recognized decades later as freedom fighters. In Algeria, over 1 million people died in the war for independence from France. Villages were burned, men were executed, women were raped, but they kept fighting for 8 long years, and they won. And in Namibia, the Herero and Nama didn't surrender when Germany declared them subhuman. They resisted, and for that, they were nearly wiped out in what many historians now recognize as one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Even those who signed treaties in good faith were betrayed. Even those who laid down arms were punished. Resistance was not just a rebellion, it was survival. These were not forgotten skirmishes. They were the crucible of African identity, forged in blood, buried by colonial history, and remembered only by those who lived it. In the final section, we'll confront the legacy, how colonization's scars still shape Africa today, in its borders, its economy, its politics, and the fight to reclaim what was taken. Colonial flags may have fallen, but their shadows remain. The borders drawn in Berlin still divide communities. Languages imposed by colonizers still dominate classrooms, courtrooms, and parliaments. Natural wealth is still exported to foreign markets, while millions on the continent struggle for basic needs. Africa was not just robbed of gold and land, it was robbed of time. Time to develop its own systems. Time to build unity between its nations. Time to educate its people on their own terms. Instead, independence began not from strength, but from survival, with fractured economies, fragile governments, and foreign debt that became a new kind of chain. Today, foreign companies still mine African soil. Foreign banks still dictate African budgets. Foreign powers still interfere, not with guns, but with loans, contracts, and influence. The scars of colonization are seen in every coup, every border conflict, every struggling healthcare system, and underfunded school. But Africa is rising. Nations are rewriting their stories. Young Africans are reclaiming their history, their identity, their pride. Artists, educators, leaders, all building what was once broken. They are not asking for pity. They are demanding truth and justice. Because understanding the past isn't just about memory. It's about healing. It's about reckoning. It's about knowing that Africa was never helpless. It was held down. And now it's time to rise. This was the story of how Africa was colonized, not by fate, not by divine right, but by brutal, deliberate exploitation. If you stayed through this journey, then you know. The history books lied. But history itself is still alive, and it's waiting to be reclaimed. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Question the version of history you were taught. Because silence protects the oppressor, but truth empowers the oppressed. Subscribe to History and Beyond to uncover the stories they tried to erase. And leave a comment below. What part of Africa's true history shocked you the most? This isn't just history. This is resistance, and it begins with knowing the truth.